"Come on, Kayla, time to get dressed." She held out her hand to the toddler, who happily made her way over, still chattering excitedly about Nebo and fishies. The Two Oceans Aquarium was based at the V&A waterfront in Cape Town. It was teeming not only with marine life but with children, teens, students, and noisy families. Bryce and Bronwyn, as a young couple with an energetic toddler, blended in completely. For once, the ubiquitous Cal and his team had been told to remain very much in the background. Bryce had commanded them to remain outside, despite Cal's obvious uneasiness with the high security risk such a busy place posed. Bryce had even chosen to drive them himself, a rarity these days, while the security team had remained a discreet distance behind them. Now Bronwyn was achingly aware of how much like a normal family they must look amidst the tide of humanity. Kayla was up on Bryce's shoulders, and her little feet frantically paddled against his chest every time she wanted him to stop and let her down so that she could investigate something closer. She had loved the touch pool, where she got to stroke and touch all manner of tide pool life, fish, starfish, and even a small octopus. She had squealed with every new sensation under her fingertips. Their little girl was nothing if not adventurous, and unlike a lot of the other children her age who backed off squealing and crying, she kept coming forward to touch something new. Of course, the highlight for her was the display of clownfish. The beautiful exhibit had actually been named Nemos. Bryce had guided her into the little bubble beneath the display, which had afforded her a 360-degree view of the tank. She had squealed and clapped in delight when she found herself surrounded by so many Nemos. It had been very difficult getting her back out to give other children a chance, but she hadn't had time to sulk with so much to see and do. Bronwyn sensed that, despite his laughter, something was not quite right with Bryce. He seemed jumpy and sweat beaded his upper lip. She often caught him looking around frantically when she was farther away from him, and then almost noticeably sagging in relief when he caught sight of her. At first she was confused by his uncharacteristic lack of composure, but then she caught the way he shrank away anytime someone brushed by him or got too close. With startling clarity, she recognized that her husband, who had once seemed so strong and infallible, feared the milling crowd of people around them. She even suspected that he was mildly agoraphobic. It explained why he had confined himself to the house these past couple of years, why he rarely ventured out, and why he preferred having Pierre or Rick come by to see him at home. This once social creature had been cut off from the world in more ways than she had known. It said a lot for how much her invitation must have meant to him. If he was willing to brave this for a day out with her and Kayla, she made her way to his side and firmly slid her hand into his. His startled gaze met hers, and when he saw the understanding glimmering there, his eyes shone with gratitude. "Do you want to go home?" she asked, and he hesitated before shaking his head. "I'm okay, now." He lifted their clasped hands gratefully, and either openly acknowledged the situation again, but she rarely left his side after that, and he seemed less tense. He appeared to be genuinely enjoying himself by the time they reached the underwater tunnel that led them through a multitude of manta rays, barracudas, tuna, and ragged-toothed sharks. The display was so awesome that even Kayla went quiet as she took in the strange, beautiful blue world that surrounded her. Her little hands were clasped together under her father's jaw, and Bronwyn watched as she started to droop more and more until her head was resting on top of Bryce's and she was fast asleep. "Hold still," she urged, digging out the digital camera and taking yet another picture of father and daughter. He grinned before taking the camera from her and stopping a passing tourist, asking the man to take their picture. He shifted Kayla so that she was cradled in his right arm, her head resting on the curve of his shoulder and her arm draped around his neck, and he hauled Bronwyn against his left side, wrapping his arm around her waist and holding her close. "Smile, sweetheart," he urged into her ear, and she was startled into obeying. The tourist took 3 pictures in quick succession before handing the camera back to Bryce. "You have a great-looking family, mate," he said in a thick Aussie accent before handing back the camera and heading off with a wave. When they left the aquarium, Bryce pushed Calla's cart while Bronwyn tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow to maintain contact. Cal and his team were taking their brief to remain discreet so seriously that Bronwyn didn't even see them. Bryce led the way toward one of the many restaurants dotting the waterfront, a Greek place that served fabulous food, and they sat down at a table beneath one of the umbrellas out in the early autumn sunshine. They were quiet for a while, watching the world go by, until Bryce broke the silence. "Thank you." She lifted surprised eyes to his solemn face. "4 earlier." He cleared his throat and she watched his Adam's apple bob sexily as he swallowed. "Thank you for earlier. Crowds are difficult for me. Ever since the accident, I can't stand being in large crowds. It's so bizarre. There I am with all these people around me, and I know there should be noise, voices, footsteps, and laughter, but instead there's nothing. It's like being in a huge void, until I'm jostled, and then it feels like being ambushed because I didn't see or hear it coming. After the accident, I was so paranoid. I kept wondering who was behind me, kept imagining someone was there, and I'd turn around so quickly that I'd startle everyone around me, only there'd be no one there, but I'd immediately get the same feeling and turn again. I knew that it would only be a matter of time before it would get to the point where I'd just keep turning round and round and round until I went insane. So before that could happen, You shut yourself in," she completed, and he nodded. "It's crazy, I know," he confessed, and she smiled with a shake of her head, covering his lightly trembling hand with her own. "No, it's not. You lost one of your senses, Bryce. Naturally, there'd be physical, mental, and emotional repercussions. I read that people go through the stages of grief after losing their hearing. Did you talk to anyone after the accident?" "You mean a psychiatrist," he clarified dryly. "I was seeing one for nearly a year. It's because of him that I was able to even contemplate coming out today. I was so much worse immediately after the accident, and I very stubbornly refused to talk to anyone. Yes, I was in denial and furious that something like this could have happened to me, but I shoved it aside because I had something bigger to take care of. I was adamant that talking to shrinks could wait. But Pierre and Rick kind of forced my hand. They blackmailed me into seeing someone." "How?" she asked, curious. One thing she knew about her stubborn husband was that when he made up his mind about something, it was very difficult to get him to change it again. He cleared his throat and gulped down a healthy mouthful of white wine. "At the time, my sole purpose was to find you," he admitted. "But I was so incapacitated, and the only 2 people I trusted to help me with that were Rick and Pierre. They had private detectives working on it, and because of my antisocial phobias, they were the ones who dealt with those detectives. They threatened to stop acting as liaisons between the detectives and me if I didn't see someone. I couldn't let that happen, and since I knew I wouldn't be able to deal with the detectives myself, I had no choice but to comply with their demands. I resented the hell out of them for imposing that ultimatum, but in the end, they saved my sanity." They remained silent for a while after that, while Bronwyn thought about everything that he had revealed, and the deafness is permanent? She asked the question that she had been too scared to broach before and winced at the immense amount of pain that darkened his eyes. "There's nothing they can do about it?" "To put it in the simplest of terms, I suffered major nerve damage in both ears. I hit my head so hard that the doctors told me I was lucky that deafness was my only major, lasting injury." "Lucky? Can you believe that?" His voice rang with outrage at the memory, and he shut his eyes briefly before shaking his head and meeting her eyes again. They told me that the damage to my right ear is less catastrophic and said that an operation might restore some of the function. It didn't work, she asked sympathetically, aching for him. What he had done to her was unforgivable, but he had paid in spades for it already, and she found herself unable to hate or resent him any longer. She just felt numb and confused. I didn't have the operation, he shrugged, and she blinked. Stunned by that information. What? Why? It seemed pointless. His jaw was set, and while she longed to prompt him for more information, she sensed that he wouldn't be receptive to any more questions. She sighed, his stubbornness and uncommunicativeness merely serving to remind her of why she felt their marriage no longer stood a chance of working. Yes, he had paid for his unforgivable and baffling reaction to her pregnancy, but they had so many other insurmountable problems. I'm sorry that this happened to you, Bryce, she said earnestly. I'm so sorry. I'm not the only one who suffered, Braun. For the first time since it happened, he was brushing it off because there was so much more he needed to know about what had happened to her during those lost years. After you left the hospital, what happened? Where did you go? Who took care of you? I really don't want to talk about this, she began hesitantly, please. The single, softly spoken word undid her more than any other could have, and she lowered her eyes to her peacefully sleeping daughter before lifting them back to Bryce. Thanks to selling the car, I had enough money for a few months' rent and food. Luckily, Kayla was a healthy baby, and I didn't have to worry about extra doctor's bills. What about you? How were you after her birth? We coped, Bryce, she said. I stayed home for a month and a half, and my next-door neighbor, Linda, would often drop by to do some of the cooking for me. The first few times I went out job hunting, Linda babysat Kayla for me. Eventually, I got the job in Plettenberg Bay, where I ran into Rick and Lisa, and the rest is history. The censorious glint in his eyes told her what he thought of the huge gaps in her story. Where did Kayla stay while you were at work? Linda usually took care of her, but Linda was elderly, and she died just before Rick found me. I got sick soon after her death, and the day I ran into Rick was my first day back at work. I hadn't found a replacement for Linda and had to hire a babysitter for the day. Her situation had been utterly desperate. Heartbroken over her friend's death, broke and sick, she was at her wit's end. If Rick had not found her that day, she didn't know what she would have done. Odds were she would have lost her job that day anyway, as she had been making too many mistakes. Bryce didn't need her to spell it out to understand how bad the situation had been, and a grim silence settled over them while they contemplated their roast lamb and potatoes, appetites lost. How was your health after her birth, Braun? He asked again, alerting her to the fact that he had noticed her earlier evasiveness on that matter. It was. I wasn't, he maintained steady eye contact, and she bit her bottom lip before shrugging and giving him the brutal, unvarnished truth. I was often sick. I was weak after giving birth and didn't get enough rest after taking Kayla home from the hospital. I was up at all hours, feeding and changing her, and then I was back at work. I never fully recovered and couldn't afford health care for myself since all of my money was assigned to buying food and clothes for Kayla. I ate leftovers at work whenever I could and the odd sandwich when I couldn't. It sounds worse than it was, Bryce. So when you got the flu, he left the statement unfinished and she nodded. Yes, it raged out of control because my immune system had taken such a beating in the past. The day Rick found me, the only reason I was at work was because Gerhard would have given my job to someone else if I'd missed one more day, and I wasn't getting paid for staying at home. I couldn't afford the doctor and had been fending off the flu with cheap over-the-counter stuff. Braun, he began. I know it was irresponsible, Bryce. I know that I had a baby to take care of and I could have gotten seriously ill or worse. You were seriously ill, he interrupted, but she continued as if there hadn't been an interruption. But I was taking care of her the only way I knew how. I was keeping her fed, healthy, and happy. I needed to work, you understand? I'd made arrangements in case anything happened to me. I made sure that the authorities would know to call you, for Kayla's sake. I wouldn't have left her alone. I knew that you'd take her if I wasn't part of the package. I knew that you'd love her and take care of her. He seemed at a loss and frowned down at his plate before sighing tiredly and scrubbing his hands over his face. God, he groaned wearily. How did we ever get to this point? He reached over and stroked one long finger down the side of her face. Eat, sweetheart. I never want you to go hungry again. Please? She couldn't resist the naked pleading on his face, and she smiled before nodding and lifting her fork, her appetite restored. He remained quiet for a while longer, breaking the silence to tell her an amusing story about taking Kayla into the office the previous day. He peppered the story with wry humor, and she found herself laughing more than she'd laughed in a long time. Eventually they started talking about other things, university and work, and for a short while, it felt as companionable and comfortable as it had been in the past. Chapter 11. Is she asleep? Bryce asked when Bronwyn joined him in the den after putting Kayla down for the night. She nodded in response to the question and tried not to let the intimate domesticity of the scene unnerve her too much. He was sprawled on one of the huge comfortable sofas that Bronwyn had begged him to buy when she had first seen it, for years ago. Yes, she was still going on about Nebo when she dropped off. He smiled faintly at that. I don't think she's going to forget about today too quickly, he murmured, fingering the rim of the glass of scotch he had poured for himself, indicating a glass of red wine on the little table beside the sofa. Wine. Not wanting to refuse and end the comfortable atmosphere between them just yet, she nodded and curled up on the opposite end of the large sofa, tucking her feet beneath her. Wouldn't it be wonderful if today turned out to be her first real memory? He smiled faintly at her dreamy question. It would be a happy one for all of us, he agreed. He tilted his head to look at her appraisingly, and she met his eyes with a laugh. What? What's your first memory? He asked, and she giggled, chasing a butterfly around our backyard, tripping over the puppy and falling down hard. According to my gran, I was 3 when it happened. She remembered because it was at my birthday party and I made such a fuss because I thought I'd hurt the dog. Apparently, I insisted that we take him to the doggy doctor. His eyes crinkled at the corners. What about you? She asked him, still smiling at her own memory. What was your first memory? The smile faded from his eyes to be replaced by a somber frown as he shrugged. I don't remember. She laughed at that. It's your first memory. By its very definition, you should remember it. He looked uncomfortable and refused to meet her eyes. Realizing that something was wrong, she tried to catch his eye. Bryce, she prompted, waving her hand to get his attention and not expecting much in the line of a response from him. If this followed the old pattern of their marriage, he would freeze her out and retreat back behind the walls that seemed to have been specifically designed to keep her out. It amazed her now, how little she actually knew of the man, and merely brought home the fact how much was still wrong, how much would always be wrong, with their relationship. She was just resigning herself to watching him get up and leave when he unexpectedly spoke, still not looking at her. My first memory is of my father. He's shouting at me and angry because I'd accidentally dropped his wristwatch into a toilet bowl. Can't really blame him, it's a gold watch. Of course, I wasn't aware of the significance of that at the time. I was 3 as well. I know because that was the same day I broke my arm, so there are records of the date. He said it almost absently, and Bronwyn's brow furrowed. "How did you break your arm?" she asked, but he wasn't looking at her and didn't see the question. She reached over and in a gesture similar to the one he'd used on her the previous night, gently tilted his jaw so that he was looking at her. She repeated the question and he seemed to shake himself out of his reverie, but when he spoke again, his voice was so horribly empty. He was very angry. He said with a shrug, "Your father broke your arm?" She needed clarity on this point and wasn't sure she understood. He nodded abruptly before draining his glass. "I'm exhausted," he muttered gruffly. "I was wondering, would you and Kayla like to go to the beach with me tomorrow? I'll fix a picnic lunch. Unless you've moved your ladies' get-together to tomorrow? Since you missed it today?" A couple of the others had other plans this weekend as well, so we decided not to meet until next week. "Anyway, the beach sounds nice," she agreed absently, not really paying attention, her mind on what he had just revealed. He smiled before getting up abruptly. "Great." He sounded pleased. "It'll be an early-ish start. I think 8 o'clock should do it." He turned to head out of the door, then hesitated and turned back to her. He leaned over her. "Thank you for today, Braun," he said sincerely, bending down to drop an unexpectedly sweet kiss onto her opened mouth. "I'll see you in the morning." "No, wait." Bryce, but he was already striding away, leaving her to fret over the unexpected information he had divulged about his father. Had it been an accident? Or deliberate? The latter possibility left her cold and unable to fall asleep for the longest time. Bronwyn woke to the conspiratorial sound of whispering just outside her door, and a bleary-eyed look at her bedside clock told that her it was 7:30 a.m. She groaned at the thought of getting Kayla up and ready in time for Bryce's early start. She was exhausted after an uneasy night's sleep. She cleared her throat and frowned when the whispering outside her door continued. She pushed herself up when the door handle turned slowly and braced for an energetic wake-up call similar to the one Bryce had received the day before. She leaned forward when nothing happened. The whispering continued for a few more moments before her daughter's dimpled face appeared around the door. When the little girl caught sight of her mother, she gasped and abruptly jerked back out of sight. "Mummy, not sleep." Bronwyn heard the toddler hiss frantically before she was shushed by an unmistakable, deep voice that always managed to send delicious shivers down her spine. Intrigued now, Bronwyn leaned even farther forward, wondering what they were up to. After another few moments of whispered exchanges, Kayla stepped around the door, already dressed in a pair of pink denim dungarees, a yellow and pink t-shirt, and her favorite pair of red squeak sneakers. In her hands she solemnly clasped a handful of multicolored autumn flowers, which Bronwyn recognized from the garden outside. "Hello, Mummy." She grinned. "Good morning, sweetheart. What do you have there?" The little girl solemnly handed her the flowers before leaning up on tiptoes to kiss her mother on the cheek. "Happy Mummy Day," the little girl said carefully in a well-rehearsed way. "Mummy's Day?" But she glanced up to see Bryce standing in the doorway with a tray clasped in his hands, her eyes huge and vulnerable in her face as she tried to figure out what on earth was going on here. "Bryce, it's not." "Yes, it is. You've missed out on two, so Kayla and I are making up for lost time." He placed the tray in her lap and removed the flowers from her numb fingers to place them in the empty vase on the tray, before moving the vase to her nightstand. He dropped a kiss on her cheek. "Happy Mother's Day, Bronwyn." Kayla solemnly held up a small gift-wrapped box, and when Bronwyn opened it she frowned in confusion. "What's this?" It was an electronic beeper-like device nestled in a custom-molded styrofoam cushion. "The smart key to your new car," he informed with a slight smile, and her eyes widened when she turned the small device over and spotted the prominent BMW logo on the other side of the key. "Bryce, this is too much," she protested helplessly. "This is nowhere near enough," he interrupted gruffly. Nothing I do can ever be enough. I don't know what to say, she said, unable to read his mood and not sure how to react. You don't have to say anything. He grinned, flashing a dimple identical to his daughter's and looking just as mischievous as the toddler. Just enjoy the car. It's not quite as sporty as the last one you had. I wanted something bigger and safer because of Kayla. But when did you? She couldn't seem to gather her thoughts, and his smile widened. I started shopping when you told me about how you were forced to sell the last one. It was delivered yesterday, but the visit to the aquarium kind of distracted me. I figured you must be sick of that Jeep by now. I know you're not a fan of it. She nodded dumbly in response to that observation, still staring blankly down at the key in her hand. Bored with the lack of attention, Kayla started tugging at her father's hand. He glanced down at her and signed something to her that Bronwyn didn't quite catch. Whatever it was seemed to satisfy the little girl because she grudgingly settled down. Take your time getting ready, he told her. Kayla and I will be downstairs packing our picnic. It's going to be a beautiful day, sunny, with blue skies and not a single cloud on the horizon. His prediction proved accurate. It was a beautiful day, the most perfect day Bronwyn had ever spent with Bryce. After leading them down to Bronwyn's gorgeous, sleek, new silver sedan, he told her that she would be doing the driving. He had only Cal on security and always a consummate professional. The man was keeping such a low profile that Bronwyn was barely aware of him in the discreet black sedan parked a few meters away from them, little nervous about test driving the new car in front of one of the worst backseat drivers that she had ever met. She tried to demur. Unfortunately, he wouldn't have it, and after strapping Kayla into the baby seat that was already installed in the back, he made quite a show of settling in on the passenger side. Bronwyn rolled her eyes and headed for the driver's side, prepared for a day's worth of male condescension from him. She was rather pleasantly surprised that he valiantly refrained from commenting when she had problems starting the keyless car. He kept a bright smile glued to his face when she ground the clutch and the car lurched forward and limped out of the driveway. She sent a nervous glance at his profile after she had finally managed to get them down to Main Street and could tell that his smile was beginning to fray at the edges after less than 5 minutes in the car. She bit back an irreverent chuckle before pulling the car over to the shoulder of the road. He glanced over at her in alarm and she smiled at him sweetly. Do you want to drive? She invited, and he grinned sheepishly. No, you're doing fine. I'm sorry if I seem tense. It's just that since the accident I've been a bit nervous in cars. That's why I have Cal do most of my driving these days. Well, I don't know where we're going, so it's better if you do the driving today, she said reasonably. I'll take over if you get tired or something. He shook his head placidly. I'll be okay, he assured her. It doesn't really matter if I'm driving or not. I'm still uneasy in a car, he grudgingly explained, and she could see how much it cost him to reveal that weakness to her. I'll give you directions. Fine, but keep the wincing down to a minimum, mister, she warned. You've always been a terrible backseat driver. What do you mean? He looked so genuinely baffled that she snorted in exasperation and restarted the car, following his directions and ignoring his occasional grimaces and harshly indrawn breaths. She drove them safely to Boulder's Beach, where Bryce spent most of the morning trying to keep Kayla away from the penguins. Bronwyn laughed helplessly at their antics. Kayla turned it into a game, running from her father while she tried to pet one of the many wild penguins that fearlessly waddled around on the beach, completely ignoring his warnings that they would bite. At around 12, when it was too hot to remain on the beach, they packed up and he directed her to the winelands of Stellenbosch. Bronwyn was becoming more confident in her handling of the car and was grinding the gears less often, which in turn meant a more relaxed Bryce. They had a picnic lunch in one of the beautiful privately owned vineyards in the picturesque Stellenbosch. It's so beautiful here, Bronwyn observed dreamily as she tilted her head back to enjoy the sun filtering through the leaves of the giant oak tree that they were picnicking beneath. They were sitting up on a hill that overlooked a vast vineyard. The vines were starting to go vivid shades of orange and red and made the entire valley look like it was aflame in the afternoon sunshine. And peaceful. How did you know about this place? The family of a business acquaintance of mine owns this vineyard. I cleared this with him. Anybody I know? She asked, tucking her feet beneath her and rummaging through the picnic basket that he had settled on the blanket. I don't know, he shrugged. Cord Strachan? As in Strachan diamonds? Her eyes widened. The Strachan family was one of South Africa's wealthiest and most influential families. They controlled a huge chunk of the diamond mining industry in the country, and the latest generation provided a rich source of fodder for local and international gossip columnists. They supplied most of our rough diamonds. He nodded. I remembered that Cord mentioned this place over one of our business lunches a couple of years ago. Before his accident, of course, any socializing had been done before his accident. The reminder saddened Bronwyn, and the awkward silence that followed was entirely her fault. Luckily, Kayla demanded attention and distracted them with her antics. Bryce kept the little girl entertained with silly games all through lunch, as Kayla had the natural tendency of a toddler to grow bored very easily. Eventually, after a companionable lunch, Bryce packed them all back into the car and directed her to drive the short distance to a small town called Clapmutz, and there introduced them to a place Bronwyn had never known existed. She stood in an enclosed tropical garden and gazed in awe at the hundreds of butterflies that fluttered around her. It was like watching a garden of wildflowers take flight, and Bronwyn could do nothing but stand and stare, her eyes filling with tears as their wings kissed her face and hair. Kayla was just as entranced. She was in her father's arms and reached out one chubby hand to try and capture the delicate creatures as they flitted by. Oh my God, Bronwyn breathed, lifting a trembling hand to her mouth. Oh my God, Bryce. He couldn't hear her, of course. He couldn't even see what she was saying as his attention was focused on the fragile creatures that were haphazardly darting from flower to flower and person to person. How dare he make this so difficult for her? Just when she had decided to contact the divorce lawyer, he did something so wonderfully tender and so unbelievably sweet. He knew that she loved butterflies, that she had always loved them. She had countless earrings, chains, charms, printed skirts, and blouses with butterflies scattered all over them. It would be so easy to believe that he had planned this day out of some manipulative need to keep her complacent. But when she looked up, she found herself charmed by the arresting picture he made with his head tilted back and his eyes closed. He was lost in his own world, enjoying the sensation of the delicate butterfly wings brushing against his face, and Bronwyn instinctively knew that he had done this to make her happy. She stood on her toes to drop an impulsive kiss on his cheek and startled him into opening his eyes. He looked down at her quizzically. This is perfect, she told him, and his eyes warmed. Thank you. He dropped an arm over her slender shoulders and gave her a quick, little one-armed hug. I saw an advertisement for this place last winter and I knew that you'd like it. Last winter? At least 6 months before her return? He had learned about this place and thought of her. Not with any hatred or resentment, it seemed. Instead, he had thought about something that would make her happy. It was startling to know that he hadn't always thought of her in anger over the last couple of years, and Bronwyn wasn't sure how to process that information. They got home shortly before 8, and Kayla was once again drooping in exhaustion. Bryce took her from Bronwyn's arms. I'll put her to bed, he offered. Bryce, you've been taking care of her all week. I should, and you've been taking care of her on your own for years. This is the least I can do, he interrupted, and she protested no further. She knew that he needed to make up for the past, but that wasn't what she wanted from him anymore. They had to think of the future and ensure that it was a happy one for all of them. Bronwyn just couldn't live with his secrets any longer. And she was only human, so she still felt so much anger and bitterness toward him for misjudging her so horribly. She went upstairs to take a hot shower, and when she headed toward the study later, she ran into Bryce as he was coming from the kitchen with a glass of fruit juice in his hand, hitting the books. His deep, quiet voice sent a little tremor of awareness shivering up her spine. She shoved back the unwanted frisson of sexual awareness and forced herself to smile. "I'm doing research on an assignment due in a couple of weeks," she explained. "Well, don't overtax yourself," he advised before heading upstairs. She saluted his back sarcastically. "Yes, sir," she said smartly before rolling her eyes at her own childishness and continuing on her way to the study. She didn't get much done before the rigors of the weekend caught up with her and her eyes drifted shut. She came awake with a start when she felt strong arms encircling her and lifting her up. "Wah. I was just taking a cat nap," she protested groggily, somehow managing to speak clearly enough for him to read her lips. "You've been in here for nearly 4 hours, and judging from the computer screen, you've done all of 5 minutes worth of work." "That wasn't a catnap, babe. You were completely out." "Just so tired," she murmured incoherently before snuggling up to his warm, strong, and naked chest. He must have been in bed until some instinct had told him to check on her. "It's okay," he soothed into her hair. "Sleep, sweetheart." She sighed contentedly, burrowed closer, and was asleep seconds after he'd deposited her in bed. It was still dark when she woke up, but the room was filling with the eerie gray light of the impending dawn. She soon recognized that she was in Bryce's room, in his bed, and wrapped in his arms. He lay spooning her, his knees tucked into the crook of hers, one strong arm snaked under her head and the other draped over her torso. His large hand was possessively spread over her abdomen. Bronwyn tried not to think about how incredibly right this felt and focused on extricating herself from his hold. She moved experimentally, but his arms flexed and his hand gently exerted a little bit more pressure on her stomach. She relaxed until she felt the tension seeping out of his arms and heard his breathing regulate again. Once she was sure he was still asleep, she subtly tried to move away again, but his reaction was the same as before. She sighed quietly and stilled her movements, wondering why he hadn't taken her to her own bed. She was still wearing the tank top she had donned after her shower the night before, but her sweatpants were missing. He must have removed them to make her more comfortable. This left her wearing only her tiny silk bikini panties, and judging from the expanse of hot, smooth male flesh pressed up against her back, Bryce wasn't wearing much more than a pair of boxers. She groaned softly, knowing that she should try harder to remove herself from his arms, but it felt so good to be held by him that she was tempted to stay where she was. She carefully laid her hand over his where it rested low on her stomach and gently tried to lift it. His hand quite unexpectedly curled around hers and she jumped in response to the touch. "I just wanted to hold you." His voice rumbled in her ear. His hand briefly tightened around her smaller hand for a few seconds longer before he let her go and removed his arm from around her waist. He shifted away from her, giving her the space to leave if she so desired. Bronwyn hesitated for a brief moment, impulsively turning around to face him. She could barely make out his expression in the pre-dawn light, and against her better judgment she reached out a hand to touch his stubbled jaw. His own hand lifted to trap her against the bristly surface of his skin. Her palm brushed against the lower edge of his sensuous lips. "If you don't leave now, Bronwyn," he left the rest of the desperately whispered warning unspoken, and Bronwyn closed her eyes briefly, praying for the strength to get up and walk away. She steeled herself and gently dragged her hand out from under his weight. "He whispered urgently, and she hesitated. He moved closer, bracing himself on one elbow to look down at her. "I'm sorry, I have to do this." Before she could react, his mouth found hers in an achingly sweet yet infinitely hungry kiss.